is Robert Perry. This is George Orwell. And I'm going to read his essay. From 1939, first published in Adelphi, London, July 1939. George Orwell's essay, Not Counting Niggers, reprinted the collected essays, journalism, and letters of Orwell. A dozen years ago, anyone who had foretold the political lineup of today would have been looked on as a lunatic. And yet the truth is that the present situation, not in detail, of course, but in its main outlines, ought to have been predictable even in the golden age before Hitler. Something like it was bound to happen as soon as British security was seriously threatened. Or you could say American security. In a prosperous country, above all, in an imperialist country, left-wing politics are always partly humbug. There can be no real reconstruction that would not lead to at least a temporary drop in the English standard of life, which is another way of saying that the majority of left-wing politicians and publicists are people who earn their living by demanding something that they don't genuinely want. Not sure what he means by that. They are red-hot revolutionaries as long as all goes well. But every real emergency reveals instantly that they are shamming. One threat to the Suez Canal and anti-fascism and defense of British interests are discovered to be identical. It would be very shallow as well as unfair to suggest that there is nothing in what is now called anti-fascism except a concern for British dividends. But it is a fact that the political obscenities of the past 2 years, the sort of monstrous harlequinade in which everyone is constantly bounding across the stage and a false nose, Quakers shouting for a bigger army, communists waving Union Jacks, Winston Churchill posing as a Democrat, would not have been possible without this guilty consciousness that we are all in the same boat. Much against their will, the British governing class have been forced into the anti-Hitler position. Read that line again. It is much against their will the British governing class have been forced. It is still possible that they will find a way out of it, but they are arming in the obvious expectation of war, and they will almost certainly fight when the point is reached at which the alternative would be to give away some of their own property instead of hitherto other people's. And meanwhile, the so-called opposition, instead of trying to stop the drift to war, are rushing ahead, preparing the ground and forestalling any possible criticism. So far as one can discover, the English people are still extremely hostile to the idea of war, but insofar as they are becoming reconciled to it, it is not the militarists, but the anti-militarists of 5 years ago who are responsible. The Labour Party keeps up a pettifogging grizzle against conscription at the same time as its own propaganda makes any real struggle against conscription impossible. The Bren machine guns pour at the same time as its own propaganda makes any real the Bren machine guns pour from the factories. Books with titles like Tanks in the Next War, Gas in the Next War, etc. pour from the press, and the warriors of the New Statesman gloze over the nature of the process by means of such phrases as peace bloc and peace front and democratic front, and in general by pretending that the world is an assemblage of sheep and goats neatly partitioned off by national frontiers. In this connection with an X, might be a typo. It is well worth having a look at Mr. Clarence K. Stright's much discussed book, Union Now. I have to Google that. Mr. Straight, like the partisans of the peace bloc, wants the democracies to gang up against the dictatorships, but his book is outstanding for two reasons. One, to begin with, he goes further than most of the others and offers a plan which, even if it is startling, is constructive. Secondly, in spite of a rather 1920-ish American naivete, he has an essentially decent cast of mind. So funny. He genuinely loathes the thought of war, and he does not sink to the hypocrisy of pretending that any country which can be bought or bullied into the British orbit instantly becomes a democracy. Say so for America as well. His book therefore presents a kind of test case. In it, you are seeing the sheep and goats theory at its best. If you can't accept in it that form, you will certainly never accept it in the form handed out by the Left Book Club, if you can't accept it in that form. Briefly, what Mr. Strite suggests is that the democratic nations, starting with 15, which he names, should voluntarily form themselves into a union. Not a league or an alliance, but a union similar to the United States, which a common government, common money, and complete internal free trade. Well, what do you know? That's the EU. The initial 15 states are, of course, the USA, France, Great Britain, the self-governing dominions of the British Empire, and the smaller European democracies, not including Czechoslovakia, which still existed when the book was written. Later, other states could be admitted to the Union when and if they prove themselves worthy. It is implied all along that the state of peace and prosperity existing within the Union would be so inviolable that everyone else would soon be pining to join it. It is worth noticing that this scheme is not so visionary as it sounds. Of course, it is not going to happen. Nothing advocated by well-meaning literary men ever happens. And there are certain difficulties which Mr. Strite does not discuss. But it is of the order of things which could happen. Geographically, the USA and the Western European democracies are nearer to being a unit than, for instance, the British Empire. Most of their trade is with one another. They contain within their own territories everything they need, and Mr. Strite is probably right in claiming that their combined strength would be so great as to make any attack on them hopeless, even if the USSR joined up with Germany. Why then does one see at a glance that this scheme has something wrong with it? What is there about it that smells? For it does smell, of course. What it smells of, as usual, is hypocrisy and self-righteousness. Mr. Strite himself is not a hypocrite, but his vision is limited. Look again at his list of sheep and goats. No need to boggle at the goats, Germany, Italy, and Japan. They are goats right enough. And Billy's at that. But look at the sheep. Perhaps the USA will pass inspection if one does not look too closely. But what about France? What about England? What about even Belgium and Holland? Like every one of his schools of thought, Mr. Strite has coolly lumped the huge British and French empires, blah, 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 blah. And I will fast forward to the point that needs to be read. The British and French empires, and this is the hypocrisy he's talking about, with their 600 million disenfranchised human beings, would simply be receiving fresh police forces. The huge strength of the USA would be behind the robbery of India and Africa. Mr. Strite is letting cats out of bags, but all phrases like peace bloc, peace front, etc. contain some implication. All imply a tightening up of the existing structure. The unspoken clause is always not counting niggers. For how can we make a firm stand against Hitler if we are simultaneously weakening ourselves at home? In other words, how can we fight fascism except by bolstering up a far faster injustice? For of course it is vaster. What we always forget is that the overwhelming bulk of the British proletariat does not live in Britain, but in Asia and in Africa. It is not Hitler's power, for instance, to make a penny an hour a normal industrial wage. It is perfectly normal in India, and we are at great pains to keep it so. One gets some idea of the real relationship of England and India when one reflects that the per capita annual income of England is something over £80, and in India about £7, the annual income. Read that again in 1939. It is quite common for an Indian coolie's leg to be thinner than the average Englishman's arm, and there is nothing racial in this, for well-fed members of the same races are of normal physique. It is due to simple starvation. This is the system which we all live on, and which we denounce when there seems to be no danger of its being altered. Of late, however, it has become the first duty of a good anti-fascist to lie about it and help to keep it in being, i.e. Israel and all these other things are a smokescreen for this global capitalist network that we live in. It's destroying the environment. What real settlement of the slightest value can there be along these lines? What meaning would there be, even if it was successful in bringing down Hitler's system in order to stabilize something that is far bigger and in its own way just as bad? But apparently, for lack of any real opposition, this is going to be our objective. Mr. Strite's ingenious ideas will not be put into operation, but something resembling the peace bloc proposals probably will. The British and Russian governments are still haggling, blah, 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 stalling and uttering muffled threats to change sides, but circumstances will probably drive them together. What do you know? And what then? No doubt the alliance will stave off war for a year or two, etc., etc. Further than that, it is difficult to see. The downward slide is happening because nearly all the socialist leaders, when it comes to the punch, are merely His Majesty's opposition. And nobody else knows how to mobilize the decency of the English people, which one meets with everywhere when one talks to human beings instead of reading newspapers. Nothing is likely to save us except the emergence within the next 2 years of a real mass party whose first pledges are to refuse war and to right imperial justice. But if any such party exists at present, it is only as a possibility in a few tiny germs. Tiny germs lying here and there in unwatered soil. Fuck y'all.